Hi, my name is Jessica Cahoot, and I'm a biology teacher at Reservoir High School in Howard County, Maryland. Today's session is called Something's Fishy. And in this session, you'll be dropped in a lake, not a real lake, but a virtual one. And we will explore the biodiversity of a community of fish and what effects changing temperature might have on dissolved oxygen levels. We will also simulate the possible effects of the changes of pH ranges on various populations of fish. The simulation makes it really interesting for students to explore the limits of what an ecosystem can handle when looking at warming temperatures and a range of pH values. And so I hope that you will enjoy what we get to do today as we look at this particular simulation called Biodiversity and the Environment. When I do this simulation with my biology students in my classroom, I have them address this question: how does changing pH and temperature affect the biodiversity in an aquatic ecosystem? And I use this simulation during my ecology unit, and I feel that it really helps me meet the standard of using mathematical representations to support explanations based on evidence about factors affecting biodiversity. And so in this particular simulation, we're looking at temperature and pH and how pH affects biodiversity and the relationship between temperature and dissolved oxygen and how that affects biodiversity. And so it really gives the students a chance to look at how these factors affect the ecosystem. They get a chance to manipulate them on their own, to collect evidence, to understand claims about what kind of abiotic factors have an effect on certain biotic factors. So let me show you what the simulation looks like, and you can check it out yourself. So this simulation is being run in the TI-Nspire CX Premium Teacher software, and I am currently a virtual teacher. So this fall, I'm 100% virtual, and I've been using this teacher software to help run some of these simulations for my students. And I will modify these simulations to meet my own personal needs in my classroom. And the great thing about this software and these simulations is that you can add and modify these documents. So in this particular simulation, we start with the title page, and then we can advance to the next page by clicking just simply on the tab at the top. I use my TI-Nspire CX calculators in my classroom, but since I can't be in my classroom, I'll use the simulations, but I'll teach my students on the handheld. They can also use the shortcut Control right click to go forward and advance a page, or Control and left click to go backwards. And sometimes when they're using their handhelds, it's a little bit easier just to do the button pushing. But for this particular simulation, I'm just going to use these arrow bars at the top to advance the next page. And in these simulations, you have a lot of information that the students can read on their own, or you can put more information depending on how you want to relate it to your own course. This background information talks about what abiotic and biotic factors are, because those are going to play an important role in the simulation. We want to know what abiotic factors are because we're looking at temperature and pH of the aquatic ecosystem. And we want to know what the biotic factors are because we're dealing with the fish in this particular lake. And having students be familiar with that vocabulary before we begin the simulation, and all that's within this background information. And so on the next page, there's some questions to reinforce some of the information the students were to learn in that reading. So giving 2 examples of abiotic factors. And so with this question, they will need to type their answers. And on the TI-Nspire handhelds, there is a keyboard. It's alphabraic, but they can type their responses right on their keypad in order to give the answer. And again, you can take these questions out, or you can add more questions in. They're totally revisable. And so the next question, it looks at which of the following ecosystem is likely to support the highest biodiversity. And so in this particular lesson, or where I use the simulation in a particular lesson, is when I'm talking about biodiversity of aquatic ecosystems. And so having them understand what biodiversity is, and that you're looking at the organisms, that the highest number of organisms or a variety of organisms within an ecosystem, and what kind of environment would support that, and just checking their knowledge. So this is great formative assessment questions before getting into the simulation itself. And so there are lots of different questions that, again, you can check for that formative assessment before moving on. You can remove these questions in any way that you want, or add more in, like I said before. And so as a virtual teacher, what I've been doing is showing these simulations to my students over whatever service you have, Google Meet, Zoom, and I will take the questions out and just have the simulations in, and we'll go over the simulations in class themselves during those synchronous times. And then what I'll do is I'll take those questions and put them in either a Google form, or I use Canvas as our LMS, or learning management system. And so that will be my formative assessment after we do the simulation in class, so that I get an understanding of what they've learned and what I might need to reteach later on. And so the directions for the simulation are currently right here. Students typically just hit the red X, but I want to reinforce, if we're doing this in class, of how they are, or what they needed to be familiar with in order to do the actual simulation, how to use the play button, how to reset, and so forth. And so in this simulation, we have our aquatic ecosystem. Our pH is 7, and our temperature is set at 23 degrees Celsius as the default. And we see that our population within our lake is at 100, and our species is 6. And so that's where we start. And if we hit play, we can see that our fish are swimming around, our 6 different species, and we have about 100 of them right here. And so when I did this virtually with my students, I would have them ask me how we want to manipulate this. What variables do we want to adjust, and how? And so they wanted to change the pH initially. So what I did was then I changed it. I asked them if they wanted to increase or decrease. In the chat, they added their response of increase or decrease, and we ended up starting with decrease. So we decreased the pH, and we talked about what happened. So the population went down to 82, and we lost a species. So there's a species that's no longer in the lake. And so we wanted to see what happened if we continue to decrease the pH. So now the pH is 5. So our population is now at 75, and we lost another species. There's only 4 species left in our lake. And then as we decrease the pH to 4, we have our population's now at 66, and our species at 3. So another species is gone. And so now at this point, they might be seeing some patterns. So I would kind of stop here and be like, well, what do you predict? What's going to happen next? So if we decrease the pH to 3, what do you expect is going to happen to our populations and species? And they would let me know in the chat of what they were interested or thinking that would happen. And then we would look and see what happened. What changes do they notice? So with the population decreasing to 43 and are losing another species, we can see it kind of some changes in the water. It's getting a bit darker. And so now we're like, okay, well, pH of 2 is pretty acidic. So what's going to happen to our lake? So we have one species left, our poor little species that is adapted to this acidic environment, but only 12 of them left. And then, of course, at this point, they really want to see what happens at a pH of 1. And so I have them predict what they think is going to happen. And then, of course, they're very excited to see this poor, sad situation of all of our fish dying. But they are very interested to get to that point. And then we can do the same thing for increasing the pH to see what happens. And so we still have six species. So we didn't lose any species, but we did lose a couple individuals in our population. And so students get a chance to play around and manipulate the variables and discover on their own what's going on in this ecosystem and how the biodiversity of it is affected by it. So there continue to be more formative assessment questions. You can check to see their understanding. Again, they're modifiable, so you can change it. There's information about pH, so students can review or learn about how pH is measured, looking at the hydrogen ions. I connect it back to understanding how pH could change an aquatic ecosystem, reverting back to the carbon cycle, and how excess carbon dioxide can be formed into carbonic acid, and then getting into ocean acidification. But depending on how you all decide to use it, it could just be a basic review of pH and how it's measured. There's also a review on what biodiversity is, kind of feeding back into that they've had a chance to look through the simulation, understand what it means, understand this relationship between those abiotic, temperature and pH, and those biotic factors, the fish, the population, the number of fish in the lake, and the number of species in the lake, and how those factors affect those values. There's a second part to this simulation. Again, when we talked about the relationship between temperature and dissolved oxygen. And so we talk a lot about how important it is for dissolved oxygen in aquatic ecosystems and how the temperature relates to that. And so in this simulation, we see our dissolved oxygen. Those are represented by our blue circles moving around in our lake. And our dissolved oxygen at this point is 8.26 parts per million, and our water temperature is at 25 degrees Celsius. And so as we increase our temperature, I have my students tell me what's happening to the dissolved oxygen. And so as we go increase, now we're at 35, will increase to 40 degrees Celsius, which is very warm. Our dissolved oxygen is about 6.3. And we can even see that the number of little circles around have decreased. And then if we decrease our temperature, see what relationship we have as we decrease the temperature and what's happening there. So we can decrease our water temperature to about 0 degrees Celsius and find out what the dissolved oxygen is here. So at 0 degrees Celsius, our dissolved oxygen is at 14.5 parts per million. And so they've seen a relationship that they can build off of. So at this point, I would ask my students, well, what is the relationship? What did you see? As we increase the temperature, what happened to dissolved oxygen? As we decrease the temperature, what happened to the dissolved oxygen? And I have them make predictions on why. Why would that happen? Why would there be less dissolved oxygen when it's hot and more dissolved oxygen when it's colder, and what that effect would be on the organisms? And so there's a little bit more that we can use here, which is this graph. So we can use mathematical models to determine the relationship between dissolved oxygen and temperature. And so I ask my students, what kind of relationship do they see here? And some of them might say, depending on their math level, that it's an inverse relationship, that as dissolved oxygen decreases, the temperature is increasing, or as the temperature is increasing, the dissolved oxygen is decreasing. And we want to talk about the effect on organisms because of that. So if organisms don't have oxygen, what's going to happen? And so the students can relate that to what we've talked about with metabolism. So the organisms need oxygen to breathe, and they need that oxygen in order to, break down glucose for cellular respiration in order to generate energy. So if there's no oxygen, they're not going to survive. And so I relate that back to dead zones, and talking about when dead zones happen in bodies of water and how that could, how that's dangerous for organisms and how that can have a ill effect on the ecosystem. And so we talk about threats to biodiversity. We talk about how whether human impact on local ecosystems can affect those abiotic factors and therefore affect the biotic factors within an ecosystem. And we try to start local, and we do some activities on our own local watershed that I want to tell you about as well. So again, I'm in Maryland, and being from Maryland, we are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and we go out and do some data collection with our students. So they go out to a stream and they collect information and evidence about our abiotic and biotic factors. So we go out and we measure the dissolved oxygen of a local stream. We look at the temperature, the pH, the nitrogen levels, and the phosphorus levels in our local streams. We also look for biotic factors. So we collect benthic macroinvertebrates, and based off those indications, we then determine the health of our local streams that lead into the Chesapeake Bay. And so I do the simulation with my students before we go out and do our field research so that they have an understanding of what these relationships are between the abiotic and biotic factors. So it gives them kind of an idea of what to look for and a good basis for figuring out whether our own local streams are healthy. And then we also then take that and lead it into possible ways and solutions to improve our local ecosystems. So what if our human impact can affect how the dissolved oxygen and pH is changed in our own local ecosystem? So what can we do to improve them? So first we have to understand why they're changing. So what's causing the temperatures to change? Is there what's causing the changes in pH, or you get into nitrogen levels or phosphate levels? So what is causing those changes, and then figuring out ways that small actions that we could do in our own local communities to help our ecosystems. And it really gives the students a sense of empowerment, and that they feel like they're contributing to something good. And so an easy simulation to do with your students to kind of give them the foundation to understand how those abiotic factors affect the biotic factors within an ecosystem. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Bye.